Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This History with Sire here today to discuss you further about our US civil rights, and we now delve into the New Deal and the solutions for trying to improve their situation in the 1930s. As always, it's important to remember this is a video lesson catered towards the student level, so our content will focus on some key knowledge and historical skills as we go throughout the series. If you haven't already, I do strongly recommend you check out earlier videos in this series. We learned about the build up towards this point in the 1930s, and especially in our last one, the catastrophe that not just affects African Americans, but the wider American people as a whole. So, all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we left our last lesson where Hoover, despite his efforts, has failed to fix the economy. The depression has really taken hold, and we've had millions of people losing their jobs, losing their property, and falling into absolute destitution. And important to remember, this is really affecting the African American people. Again, a lot of African Americans, they left the southern states and they moved up to the northern states for that industrial work in the cities. But now unemployment has rose so much, now the economy is really collapsing. It seems like the solution just to leave the south and go to the north has failed. And the pressure really now is on the government to try and fix these problems, not just for African Americans, but America as a whole, and try and solve this big crisis that they've fallen into. So, who is Roosevelt and what is the New Deal? Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been a person of politics for many years now. Roosevelt has been here as the Democrats ever since the late 1910s. He actually ran on the ticket back then to try and beat the Republicans, but did, of course, fail. Why are things different now? Well, Roosevelt is going to capitalize on the Republican flaws and faults. The Republicans had three major failures in the Great Depression. One, they didn't believe in big government. We had Hoover really resisting this effort to force businesses to help out. He relied on voluntarism rather than interventionism and relied on his laissez-faire economy. The laissez-faire approach also appeared to have failed by letting things stay as they were, by trusting the individual to run things themselves. We ended up with banks collapsing, people losing their jobs, and people losing their livelihoods. And then the third thing Roosevelt wants to change is the image of the president. Like, it's important to note we've had three Republican presidents in a row who all had some major flaw with them. We had Warren Harding, who had a big Teapot Dome scandal. We had Calvin Coolidge, who was not very personable, quite introverted, and didn't really feel very present in the lives of Americans. And then we had Hoover, who made many mistakes, and with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, according to many economic historians, actually made things a lot worse. So Roosevelt capitalizes on this in 1932 and he wins the presidential election by an absolute landslide. To date, it's still one of the biggest victories any American president has ever achieved. I'm sure you remember me saying as well, the African Americans also changed sides and supported the Democrats, a party that had a history of being racist and, of course, impeding against. The last Democrat president, Woodrow Wilson, made lynching laws against the African American people. This is a bold move. It really says a lot about how much the Republicans really messed up. That actually African Americans in the North are going to really back the historically racist Democrat Party. So let's put him to the test. What is Roosevelt going to do to improve things? Well, he practices the New Deal, a new interventionist philosophy for what the Democrats can do. This New Deal is going to be a series of domestic programs acted in the United States between 1933 and 1938. They included not just laws passed by Congress, also the president exerted his executive orders all the way throughout his first term to make sure things happened. There's three key ways to remember this New Deal, what it's aiming for, and they're the three R's: relief, recovery, and reform. We have to relieve the unemployed who have lost their jobs and lost their livelihood, especially about 20% of America's working class majority. We need to recover the economy, get it back to the normal levels of the pre-1930s catastrophe, and to make sure that actually they then reform the financial system to secure the banks and make sure this Great Depression can never happen again. So Roosevelt, to do this, was a supporter of the pro-spending majority in Congress. He gained incredible power to redefine how much the government should intervene to help in America. Whereas the Republican Party had focused on individualism and laissez-faire economics, now we have the interventionist method. But what's it going to be, and how is Roosevelt going to do it? Well, the first thing they want to tackle is the banks. Prior to the New Deal, the banks were unregulated. This meant the banks were just freely loaning that money off to anyone they could see fit, and that was with massive, enormous risks. And we saw the massive risks, and we can see in our previous video, caused a big collapse in the economy. By the early 1930s, the banking sector itself was in near collapse, and the Great Depression was really seated inside the American economy because they loaned out billions and billions to individual consumers and also to nations like Britain and France to fund them as well. However, the problem was, as we should remember, this money was no longer being able to repay. People were selling, they were then losing money and trying to sell again to kind of get these loans off, which is why the American system essentially had a big heart attack. The American could not even take out a loan on itself. The average American could no longer take out a loan. They could no longer buy a car. They no longer had a job to work. And things really were dire for many of them. So Roosevelt made a big first step, which was to try and control the banks, to actually abandon laissez-faire economics and instead allow government, big government, to have control. And this meant you would have to have higher taxes and you would have to regulate the banks and abandon the philosophy of laissez-faire the Republicans have bought into for over 10 years. So to do this, Roosevelt created the Banking Act of 1933. This regulated the banks and stopped them doing speculative activities. By doing this, the risks made were thoroughly reduced, and it also meant that the government was promising any American citizen that they could return any lost money, up to a certain amount, of course, rather than allow things to become bankrupt. This was a huge success. Over the next 5 years, the banks did not take any risk because they were not allowed to, and the American economy did not suffer any major shocking damage that it had done during the Great Depression. Another thing is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, also set up in 1933. Roosevelt knew that he had to get people back into work, give them a sense of purpose and a sense of livelihood again. And so to do that, his government actually was going to borrow money, create jobs, and then put it back into the pockets of those people who were unemployed. This was a massive stimulation to the economy. He was going to use it to kickstart things and get them growing and prospering again. And we can see with the key image here, we have a big shift in this happening. The government is going to increase their spending and the GDP is going to rise and recover as a consequence. To do this, FEAR was going to give loans and operate relief programs because, again, they want to reduce unemployment and make sure there's new jobs to train these people in and give them a sense of purpose. This was indeed more expensive to actually create jobs using mass borrowing than it was to simply pay out some dole or welfare benefit like the Republicans had tried to do. But Roosevelt believed that he wanted people to go to work. He knew that many people were psychologically harmed by the Great Depression, especially after they had such a good time in the 1920s with so much prosperity. And so by giving the men, giving the workers the chance to work, they could restore their dignity and give them a sense of pride in themselves as Americans again. These FERA projects spread all the way out from construction to writers' projects to musicianships to just general production of consumer goods. And by doing this, by producing these goods like canned food, garments, mattresses, bedding, they were allowing people to finally have freedom again, the freedom to own, the freedom to buy, the freedom to feel like life was good again. This was small steps, of course. This is a gradually over time kind of activity, but it was actions all the same. And the third and final step was to improve workers' rights and benefits. One way he did this with the Social Security Act of 1935. This meant he actually created an official social insurance that ensured that poverty rates, especially those in the senior citizen category, would not exceed too high value again. The act also meant that they could protect people against unforeseen dangers in life, for instance, disabilities, surprise unemployment, consequential poverty, the burden widowers may have to face, and even being old age and being unable to work anymore. Taxes were also increased by an additional 2% on the workers. By the standards of our economy in today's Western world, this seems quite trivial. This is borderline basic for what you'd expect an economy to have. But FDR was the first major party in America to really give this a go, really prove interventionism could be effective. And so, as we can see in this first term with Roosevelt in power and in control, there were a lot of successes. The banks were more stable, FERA got people back into work, and we now had and American people who felt more secure about the future rather than that they were going to keep falling into catastrophe as time was going on. It seemed that laissez-faire economics was dead and buried and would not be practiced for many times to come. This is all well and good. This is the plan. This sounds like, it's all going to be repaired and everything's going to get better. But for the sake of our topic, does the New Deal actually benefit the African American people? And that is what we're going to find out in the third and final video on this series, where we look at the 1930s and, of course, the Great Depression and New Deal. If you like what you're watching so far, do make sure you subscribe. There's going to be more content, as always, in this series as we go on, learning about civil rights and presidential politics and economics as we go through it. Thank you, as always, for watching. I hope you found it quite insightful. This is History with Sire. Thank you for listening.